The Subcommittee on Defense will come to order. This morning, the committee will receive testimony on the posture of the National Guard and Reserve components and their fiscal year 2020 budget request. This will be a two-panel hearing. Panel 1 recognizes the Chief of the National Guard Bureau. Panel 2 will recognize the Reserve component chiefs from the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force Reserves. I would encourage all members to stay for both panels. Our witness for Panel 1 is General Joseph Lengel, Chief of the National Guard Bureau. General, we are very pleased to have you here with us today, a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This subcommittee has provided the Reserve component with significant resources through the National Guard and Reserve equipment account, an appropriation which is not included in the President's budget request, as well as additional funding for counter-drug operations, Humvee modernization, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and more. However, we would like to cover all aspects of funding for the Guard and Reserve today, to include your request for funding in the military personnel and operations and maintenance accounts. With that, I thank you again for appearing before the committee today to discuss these important issues. We will ask you to present your summarized statement in a moment, but first I would recognize my good friend and colleague, Mr. Calver, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Visclosky and General Lengel. Welcome. While our national defense strategy is now focused on great power competition, we must remain mindful of the important role our National Guard members play in fulfilling these critical national security challenges. Meeting the challenges posed by adversaries such as Russia and China will also require that the National Guard is fully engaged, trained, and equipped so they may be fully compatible with the active components. We've relied heavily on the men and women of the Guard, more than 850,000 deployments since 9/11, and they performed admirably as they have been called upon time and time again in the fight against counterinsurgencies. Look forward to hearing from you today about how you've been involved in the national defense strategy and the key roles that the Guard plays with respect to the war fight, defending and securing our homeland, building enduring partnerships. Thank you again for your service, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, sir. General, your full written testimony will be placed in the record, and members have copies. One round of questions for each member present. In the interest of time, I strongly encourage you to keep your summarized statements to 5 minutes or less, and to be complete, obviously, as you have always been in your answers, but as succinct as possible in responding. General, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Visclosky, Ranking Member Calvert, and distinguished members of this committee. It is a pleasure to be here today, and Mr. Chairman, at this time I would like to submit my full written statement for the record. The National Guard consists of nearly 450,000 citizen soldiers and airmen of the Army and Air National Guard. They represent the finest National Guard force in our history, and I am honored here today to represent them along with their families, their communities, their employers, who all support them. The National Defense Strategy outlines the priorities for our military to deter war, protect the security of our nation. My focus remains on the 3 primary missions, which are the war fight, defending and securing the homeland, and building enduring partnerships. Each one of these missions directly supports the National Defense Strategy. In the war fight, on any given day, approximately 30,000 men and women of our National Guard support every combatant command around the globe. Our soldiers and airmen work with allies and partners to compete against adversaries below the threshold of armed conflict, to expand our nation's competitive space, and to ensure we have and maintain an advantage. We are poised in regions where our men and women are postured to delay, deter, and deny adversarial aggression. The National Guard is prepared to surge and expand its support in times of war, and we are always ready and always there to defend the homeland. As the space domain increasingly becomes a war domain, our Air and Army Guard space units are vital to the space mission as this domain becomes ever-encompassing. As with our units in the Army and Air National Guard, it is imperative our space units remain aligned with their parent services, including any future potential Space Force. In the homeland, the National Guard has, on average, about 10,000 guardsmen, men and women, soldiers and airmen, conducting homeland operations every single day. Your Air National Guard fighter wings are protecting our nation's skies in 15 aerospace control alert sites, including the skies over the Capitol here today. Our cyber units continue to protect our networks from malicious cyber attacks. 27 of our state's National Guards were on duty and provided support in state active duty during the most recent elections, ensuring their integrity. The National Guard is also crucial to our nation's ballistic missile defense as proliferation of missile technology continues to expand. On top of all this, the National Guard is ready to respond to emergencies such as hurricanes, wildfires, and flooding, as well as assist law enforcement during times of civil unrest, missions that the National Guard performs with little or no notice. Last year, the National Guard was called up 195 times to respond to homeland emergencies. Our presence in communities around the nation uniquely posture us to respond when our communities need us. The National Guard's success in warfighting and homeland operations is a direct result of the enduring partnerships we build with international, federal, state, and local partners. The National Guard, through the State Partnership Program, now partners with 83 nations. This low-cost, high-return program builds enduring partnerships based on mutual trust and generates security cooperation around the globe. To date, the National Guard has co-deployed 80 different times with our partner nations. On the federal, state, and local levels, our deep partnerships and National Guard's unique authorities ensure a speedy response with unity of effort during times of domestic crisis. To ensure the readiness of the National Guard to be deployable, sustainable, and interoperable with our active components, we require such things as appropriate levels of full-time support and replacing and upgrading old and worn-out facilities. We also require parity in equipping our force through concurrent and balanced modernization and recapitalization of our force. Mr. Chairman, I offer my sincere thanks to and deep gratitude to this committee for the long history of support for the National Guard. During my time as Chief of the National Guard Bureau, the National Guard has seen increases in critical modernization and recapitalization that include C-130Js, Apaches, Blackhawks, Humvees, C-130s, and C-130 propulsion modernization. This committee's support for this program have provided and will provide for increased lethality of our National Guard and its readiness. Mr. Chairman, I thank this committee for the continued support of the National Guard Reserve Equipment Account. For decades, this account has enabled the National Guard to field a ready force that can both defend the nation and respond to emergencies in every community, district, territory, and the state across our country. To all the members of this committee, thank you for taking the lead in support of your men and women in the National Guard and their families. I am honored to be here representing them today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General. Begin questions. Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you again, General. I appreciate your being here today. This subcommittee has placed a great deal of emphasis on modernization, the total force, to ensure that the Guard and the Reserve have equipment compatible with the active force. Can you discuss the impact that this had on the National Guard and with respect to deployments alongside the active component and with respect to fulfilling your homeland defense missions? Recently, the Guard was called to help fight wildfires in California, and so as a side note, I wanted to know if we have adequate equipment to address those needs.
Well, yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir, for that question. And this operational force that the National Guard has become has caused us to, more than ever before, to have to be deployable, sustainable, and interoperable with our service components, with the Army and with the Air Force. In my view, that means that the old ways, the old days of where you would buy new equipment and you would put it into the active component and you would cascade the older equipment into the reserve component, I believe is really no longer a relevant model. I mean, in any conceivable scenario where the United States is going to have to go to war with a peer competitor, it's pretty much agreed that everyone is going to have to fight. The active component, the Guard, the Reserve, everyone will be there. Whether you deploy on day 20 or whether you deploy on day 50 or whether you deploy on day 120, all of the components of the services are going to have to go to war. And when you get there, you're going to have to be able to plug in, you're going to have to be able to communicate, you're going to have to be able to sustain all of those war-fighting functions that we have, which means we're going to have the same equipment as the active component. So over time, you know, and we do have some older equipment in the National Guard just by nature of the modernization process. Some of the older C130s, some of the Apaches are being modified, some of the tanks are being modified. And I believe that it's incredibly important that the service, and to a large degree they are, modernizing our force structure in accordance with the active component as we go forward. Whenever we're modernized and ready to go here in the homeland, those equipment make us more ready to do what we need to do in any respect, whether it's fighting fires with new helicopters, new Black Hawks that we have in California. They're used to extinguish fires with fire extinguishers, as we saw many times last year. So it's incredibly important that we maintain a modern reserve component and National Guard.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've had our fair share of fires in California, and the Guard's been very helpful in that, so we certainly appreciate that. And I know they got some new Black Hawks to help combat that, so we're grateful that they have them. So thank you.
We're grateful to you, sir, for getting them for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rupersberger.
General, first, thanks for the meeting in our office, and based on that meeting, I have a question I'm going to ask you. First thing, in 2015, there was a joint emergent operational need, called GEON, for 72 advanced electronically scanned array, which is ESA radars from the National Guard. These systems significantly improved air-to-air detect and risk in support of the Aerospace Control Act mission in the defense of the homeland. Did you get all that?
I did, yes, sir.
Okay, fine. I believe that there are 100 of the F-16s still in service for the Air Force, National Guard, and Reserve, and some of these platforms are expected to be in operation in 2040. It is essential that these aircraft remain operationally viable against the increasing sophisticated threats. Two questions. Would additional Air National Guard squadrons benefit from these ESA radar upgrades? And two, what benefits would these new radars provide?
Well, yes, sir. I mean, without a doubt, the defense of the homeland is one of the things that we do in manning the alert sites, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. And the acquisition of the active electronically scanned array radar will allow us to better identify, detect, target, and defeat potentially weapons that could be used against the homeland. So the 72 platforms that we have, the 72 ESA radars that are coming, will be a big help, and they will be stationed 8 each at the F-16 locations at those alert sites. That does create some problems for us in that we will now have a mixed fleet of different kinds of radars in these squadrons, which makes it difficult because these squadrons do more than just protect the homeland. We deploy in support of other combatant commands around the world, and it makes logistics more difficult. So without question, we would like to see that eventually the entire fleet of F-16s begin a modernization with the ESA radars. We have an additional 261 F-16s that will not, under the current program, be upgraded to the with the ESA radars. So I think it's important that we consider that, you know, should funds become available, that the Air Force consider modernizing more than just the 72 that are currently in the plan for the National Guard.
Would this be a high priority for you and National Guard and Reserve?
I believe it would. I believe it would be it would make it a more capable platform. It does more than just detect threats. I mean, it's an enhanced new generation sensor that makes the aircraft actually more survivable in a combat environment. There's many reasons that we would want to have a...
Give me an example of how it would work.
Well, I mean, the radar, it functions differently than the old phased array radars that actually have moving parts. It's easier to maintain once it's on the platform. It functions differently in terms of how it emits energy and how it returns and receives energy to identify targets. It can see smaller targets. It can see cruise missiles, perhaps, that may be shot you know, at the United States. So that's one way it would see as it would target incoming threats. The other thing it can do is actually act as a sensor, where it can actually find other types of electromagnetic energy that may be targeting that platform itself, so that it can then become a more survivable platform in combat.
Okay, you're back.
Thank you.
Thank you, General. I just have a quick follow-up there. So you were talking about 72 platforms, new, that'll be the new radar. How many total?
Well, there are
That
72.
you said you got there's a mixed fleet, and you got to figure out how to get everything working together. How many old radars will still be online?
There'll be an additional 261 radars that are still out there.
Okay, so there's 261 old ones.
On
70
top of the 72 new ESA
ones.
radars, that's correct.
Okay. And how long does it take to get all those working together?
Well, I think, I don't know exactly, I mean, it's a relatively, it's not a hugely long time to install a radar, but I mean, it would be, we have to acquire the radars and have them installed. It would be a matter of years. About 50 airplanes would cost about $110 million. If we did 50 a year, it would take, 5 years, essentially times about $600 million to do the whole fleet.
Okay. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for visiting in my district last year.
Yes, sir.
To observe the counter-drug program, which is very, very effective, by the way. So thank you for being there for that and for our recent visit. The Kentucky Guard State Partnership Program is working very well, thank you. Djibouti and Ecuador. And that's a very beneficial program for the country, but especially for the Guard. As you know, it's been one of my priorities to ensure that the Air National Guard modernizes its C-130 fleet. There are C-130H models, now some of the oldest in the Air Force, and they need both upgrades and new planes. Tell us what the Air National Guard is doing to keep these aging aircraft viable and to meet warfighting and domestic response missions.
Yes, Chairman Thurst, thank you very much for the question. And our C-130 fleet, obviously, we have a lot of older model C-130Hs in the National Guard. We have, I believe it's 14 units and about 133 C-130H models in our fleets. And the C-130H model is getting older. So we have a program to modernize it, the Avionics Modernization Program 1 and 2, which are currently ongoing, and there's money in the program to modernize these platforms. And then the additional modifications that we are doing to try and make the aircraft more viable for a longer term is we're actually doing some propeller and engine modifications to the C-130 fleet. Right now, there is no additional money in this year's budget to modify the propulsion systems and the engines of our C-130H models. But over long term, as you may have read, we've had some issues with some of the older C-130s and their propeller blades, and for a while this year, some of the fleets were grounded as these older blades that were unflyable. So we believe that we have to do two things. Predominantly continue some of the modernization efforts with the Avionics Modernization Program, continue that. And additionally, we would think it's necessary to continue the propellers and propulsion modernizations as well for some of these platforms. Conversely, it's always a choice. As you know, the Air Force hasn't put any more money against the C-130J model for our fleet, the recapitalization of that program. But I believe that at some point we're going to probably consider wanting to do both, as in terms of thank the committee for adding 8 C-130Js last year and 6 the year before that and 2 the year before that, which allowed us to begin to actually recapitalize an older C-130 fleet. So I believe over time, as we continue the modernization process, it'll be a consideration to consider buying more J models at some point in the future to continue the fleet such that it's just going to get older. It's going to need to be modernized.
Well, as you are well aware, this committee provided funding for 16 new
We did.
J's between fiscal 17 and 19. Where will these aircraft be based, and on what timeline for those 16?
So there's a process inside the Air Force, a basing process that the Air Force uses and the Air National Guard participates in. The Air Force sometime later this fall, probably fall of 19, will determine the the preferred locations and potential alternates on where these bases, aircraft might be based. And then when they become available to bed down, I believe in 22, as I think when we get the first aircraft, we'll have selected places where we can bed down the new C-130Js. But those decisions of alternative locations, primary locations, won't be determined until later this year, sir.
Do you expect future presidential budget requests for more 130Js for the Air Guard?
Well, I'm not aware of there being a plan to buy more, but I would recommend that we consider that. The flying hour cost for the C-130s J models are lower. The sustained maintenance costs over time are lower. And like any old platform, the longer you have a platform there, the C-130H will progressively get more and more expensive to maintain and to fly so that it can be deployable, sustainable, and interoperable. And as you know, we rely heavily on that aircraft in the homeland as well for all sorts of disaster response. So it's a very important platform to the National Guard and to the Air Force.
Thanks, General.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, General. I have a couple questions. You mentioned in your opening statement you had about 10,000 guardsmen operating around the homeland. Can you talk to us a little bit about the elections process? I think that's something we're all very interested in. Could you give us some detail on what the role of the Guard has been around elections?
I can tell you that if you're referring to the cyber activity during the recent elections, we did. I believe that this year coming in to the election season, this past election year, there was a concern of the security of our networks, and so the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and myself at U.S. Northern Command brought all the adjutants generals in to Colorado Springs. And we gave them a brief on here's how we view the threat of that international actors may portray to our networks, to driving changes in the narrative, to driving general swaying the political process in the U.S. So at least all of the states had awareness of what may be happening in and around their states with respect to manipulating information via the networks or the like.
So when you say that, can you be clear as to what you mean? Foreign actors trying to influence?
Absolutely. Is where there were Russians playing on our networks, or as you widely read in the press, of people trying to manipulate the narrative, political narratives here in the United States.
So what exactly do they do? There's an issue that comes up. Here's the election. It's a polarizing issue in the country. What do they do?
Well, I believe that they, we were discussing how perhaps they use social media and various bots and things to create a political narrative that may sway one way or the other an election campaign. I think that there were people that were concerned about actually people manipulation of networks and vote totals and those kinds of things. I think with respect to the National Guard and what were they doing, on Election Day, they were trying to monitor the security of networks in state.gov networks, not DoD networks, state.gov networks. And on Election Day and during election season, we had 27 states that had some cyber capacity, state active duty, monitoring the security of state.gov networks. And I think we continue to learn how to do this better. We continue to learn how to stay connected with what may be a security issue with respect to our networks, which was not a DoD issue, perhaps maybe a DHS issue or some other capacity, but we're involved in it.
So I'm going to take some liberties because I'm the chairman right
Yes,
now.
sir.
This will not happen again for a long, long time, I think. So these, and then we're not in a classified setting either, so obviously you want to be careful. But these foreign countries are coming in here. They find a rift in our social media platforms and conversations that we're having. They actually create content, right? Like if there's an issue that's polarizing and there's one party's on one side and one's on the other side, they like the fact that there's this conflict within our country, and then they try to throw gasoline on it. Right?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, that's possible, but I mean, from how the National Guard played in this thing, they were strictly monitoring the security of the networks. They were not doing anything with respect to monitoring narratives or information.
So what do we do if we find these bots that are kicking out content? What's our response to that? We shut them down?
You know, I think that there would be some other DHS, Cyber Command, some other entity besides the National Guard would take an issue with that. I think awareness. I think, you know, in general, the society's need to validate data before what you believe, what you read on the internet or social media is, you know, kind of a foundational issue that we need to deal with. But
Yeah.
that's got really nothing to do with the National Guard's cyber enterprise.
That's why I bring it up, because I think this is one of the fundamental issues in the country right now, is that our adversaries are intentionally trying to keep us divided in the country. And it's not a political statement, it's a statement of security and our ability to move forward as a country. So I wanted to just highlight that. One last question before we move on. Readiness has obviously been a huge issue going back to Iraq and Afghanistan and then sequestration. Can you just talk to us a little bit about your feelings on the Guard's readiness at this point and how your budget that you're submitting is trying to fill some of those gaps?
Yes, sir. I think obviously readiness is the #1 priority. Readiness and lethality for the National Defense Strategy. It is the Army's #1 priority. It's the National Guard's #1 priority. I think that from a readiness perspective, the National Guard is as ready really as it's ever been. We have a cycle, a discipline training program that fits into a model that supports the utilization of the operational force. Because of that, we have, the Army has invested in us and given us more combat training center rotations. We have 4 combat training center rotations in this year's budget. They have slightly increased the number of flying hours for our Army aviation helicopter pilots. We have increased, you know, some sustainment programs inside the Air Force to maintain and increase the readiness on the Air National Guard side as well. We have continuously worked on our medical readiness, which is the Army National Guard readiness is 89%. It's the highest component, individual medical readiness inside the Army. So we have worked very, very hard to become a force that is accessible and ready and able to be mobilized quickly if the nation needs us. We do have issues that we continue to say that could enhance our readiness. The one program that remains at risk, I believe at a high level of risk for the Army National Guard, is the level of full-time support that we are manned at. We are manned at 64% of what the Army requirement says we need to maintain our readiness. It's the lowest readiness account when you look at training and medical and sustainment. It's the only account really that we man at such a low sustainment rate. So I would like to see over time us continue to work on improving, perhaps reducing the risk of our full-time support inside the Army National Guard. But overall, the readiness of the reserve component as we go, and we generally are at a lower level of readiness than the active component anyway on the air side. Same on the Army side. Same on the air side. I think it's relatively good news story inside this budget for readiness. It was maintained a high priority throughout the budget.
Mr. Quare.
Thank you, General, for what y'all do. I know there are some states that have not been able to meet any of their personnel quotas for the National Guard units, and then you have a state like Texas that has over 21,000 personnel. And I think, you know, if they're given the opportunity to grow with the additional manpower slots or associated funding, I think it would help the overall cost. Are there any discussions or any way we can help you on those discussions about the possibility of realignment manpower slots from those states that can't achieve their quotas and move them to states like Texas that have the capacity? And I don't want to take anything away from anybody, but if they're not able to do it, then don't penalize a state like Texas that's willing to step up.
Well, yes, sir. We have a project ongoing right now inside, again, the Army National Guard to look at across the nation where do we have units that are not able to recruit to full manning levels inside the Army National Guard. And if we, as this on goes, and it'll go on over the summer, we will look to reposture under-recruited force structure from a state that simply can't recruit to it anymore into states. Texas is one who obviously has the ability to recruit over and above its current force structure. There are other states that can do that, but there's a project undergoing right now inside the Army National Guard to look at perhaps restationing structure that can't be recruited in other states.
Mr. Carter and I would be very interested in this. So if you can keep us posted on this, we would appreciate it. Again, nothing to take away from any states, but if they're given the opportunity and they can't do it, then give them to states that are willing to do that. So appreciate if you can give us something in writing and just keep us posted on that. The other thing is, I know that the National Guard has been dealing with counter-drug programs for many years, I think more than 30 years. GAO report, as you know, found out that the DOD strategy is out of date and doesn't reflect current drug threats. And as you know, the bad guys have the money, have the resources to be constantly changing. And then in 2014, the National Guard rescinded the guidance for states on how to operate and administer the program and hasn't replaced it yet, unless if y'all have done that since the GA report. And then DOD has funded state counter-drug activities without first approving their plan. So can you tell me how the National Guard and DOD are addressing these issues?
Yes, sir. I am aware of the GAO report that came out in January. It made 5 recommendations. You mentioned 3, I think 3 of them right there. We are in the process of putting out new guidance so that the current National Guard, Chief National Guard Bureau instruction will be on the street here very quickly. I am also aware of the discussion of aligning the state plans and making sure that the state plans were submitted and approved before we disperse funding. We've already got mechanisms in place to make sure that that happens. The other 2 issues, the aligning the threat-based resource model, or how we allocate the specific funding in accordance with the strategy. The general officer group that decides and helps us craft the appropriate threat-based resource model is meeting next week to begin to go over aligning the threat-based resource model with the national counter-drug strategy to make sure that they're aligned. So I'm aware of them. There are 4 things specific to me and the National Guard Bureau. We've addressed 2 of them so far and 2 more to go, and I'm happy to update that to you soon.
Right. And then just to finish one last thought, the state partnership program is a great program. I see where you're at. I know Texas is involved and so many other states, and I appreciate what they're doing. Why is Mexico not included? I mean, there's so much emphasis by the president and other folks on Mexico. Do y'all need some help meeting some people down there?
No, sir. I think, every nation has to...
By the way, you know, they're working on their own National Guard.
I know.
Yeah.
That's good.
I want to be helpful. I know my time is up, but I'd love to follow up. But if you need to meet some folks, I'll be happy to introduce you and move the process. But I think, and I know there's a sensitivity between the U.S. and Mexico. I understand all that. But I'd be happy to work with you to find a state that's willing to work with Mexico. I mean, there is so much emphasis. I mean, if we can't do something with our own next-door neighbor, I think we're missing something here.
Yes, sir. And as you know, the state, the nation that is going to be partnered has to request a partnership. And thus far, Mexico has not requested to be a partner. This has happened before. There are some nations who believe sometimes that they don't want to partner with a state, they want to partner with a nation. They're a full nation, they want to partner with the United States, not any particular state. That's changed over time. Brazil used to have the same thought. We just signed a partnership last week between Brazil and the state of New York. I think that we'd be obviously more than willing to supply a partner to the nation of Mexico if they desired one, and the combatant commander supported it. I think it'd be a great plan.
Yeah, I'll work with you. Thank you.
Judge Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. Thank you for being here. I want to ask you a question that's kind of peculiar to my office right now. Right now, it is a national policy for all 50 states that active duty military personnel children are flagged by the schools so that parents, so that teachers, counselors, and administrators know that these are military children, because military children generally can have special needs with dad or mom being deployed and that type of thing. The issue's been raised to me, which I agree with, that we are deploying the Guard and the Reserve at historic levels, and I think those children should be flagged also for special counseling needs and so forth. And it's just a matter, really, of putting the computer and flag them. But it brings that, so if a child's acting out, they can see, hey, their dad or mom may be deployed and they may need some help. Do you agree that would be a good addition? Or if you don't,
No, I
tell me
think
why.
it'd be a fine addition, sir. I think that, you know, the National Guard, the business model usually means that people stay in the same community for many, many years. So they'll go through an entire school system and they won't move. But I think that identifying them as military members with parents who deploy and parents that may have stress, I think it'd be a good thing.
I think so too. Let's talk about the southern border,
Sir.
which we have quite an interest in our state. According to this, 6,000 Defense Department personnel are down there, of which about 2,100 are National Guard troops, and they have assisted in 23,000 arrests and helped seize 35,000 pounds of illegal drugs. Can you tell us about your deployments along the southwest border and highlight any successes you have, and give us your opinion about long-term needs for National Guard troops on the border to assist DHS?
Sir, I can. I was on the southwest border this past weekend. I was actually in Arizona. I went to Nogales, and I've been to Texas on that southwest border as well. We've been now on the southwest border this time. As you know, we've been on the border many other previous times. This time we've been on there since April 10th of last year. And we have been on a mission in direct support of the Department of Homeland Security to assist them with security on the border. We are not doing any law enforcement activities. We are not doing any detainee or immigration operations. We are doing simply tasks that allow Customs and Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection officers to be more available to do the law enforcement and business of, hands-on business of securing the border. Without a doubt, the National Guard forces are making a big difference, enabling the Department of Homeland Security to help secure the border. They were effusive in their praise, and they're doing everything from helping keep vehicles working to help clear brush so that they can actually see and secure the border, to aviation activity, to monitoring security video cameras of issues on the border and calling out when technology has indicated that somebody has breached the border, such that a Customs and Border Patrol agent could be dispatched to, if required, to go interdict and engage perhaps an immigrant going down there.
Right.
So I can tell you that without a doubt, they relayed to me, the Customs and Border Patrol, that they are overwhelmed, that without having the National Guard forces on the border, at least now, they don't see being able to secure the border to the degree that they need to without the assistance of the continued National Guard. I don't know how much longer we're going to be down there, certainly through the end of this year. The current Operation Guardian support that we do is ongoing, and we're starting to look at this mission as if it may be an enduring mission in the terms of 2 or 3 years long. So I believe that they are making a difference. They are helping secure the border for DHS and their responsibility, and everyone who's down there is a volunteer. They enjoy the mission. They're getting a lot out of it. They want to be there, and I suspect that we'll be there for some time.
I suspect you will be too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, General, for being here. I represent a Southern Arizona district. Where were you in Arizona last week?
I was in Nogales.
Oh, you were? Okay,
Dallas, yes, sir.
okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So I have Tucson and then Cochise County, which is sort of southeast of there. But,
Yes.
Well, great.
I was there.
Glad you were there. It was
Yes.
a beautiful week in Arizona. So,
It was.
you know, as of March 4th, there were 2,362 Guard personnel supporting Operation Guardian support along the southwest border. I know that you're supporting DHS and border protection and administrative tasks and aviation support. You're not doing any law enforcement missions. But I understand that some governors have started pulling support for the border mission. How do you effectively plan for Guard personnel to execute the mission if the governors do not approve their deployment?
Well, there's multiple ways you can use the National Guard. One way is under Title 32, which is under state, federally funded, but state control, which is how we're doing it right now. There are 21 states currently providing support to the now 2 border states, Texas and Arizona. New Mexico governor has decided to not do any more Guard support. There's still a few on the border, but they're winding down. California is also, their numbers are, they were at 350 and they're on their way down to a much smaller number, and so they don't want any other states there. So when you're using the Guard in a Title 32 status, the accepting state must approve the governors to come in. So that's one way we're doing it. Should the nation, the Department of Defense, want to use the Guard in a Title 10 mobilized status, they certainly could do that. And then they would use them like any other part of the force. I know of no intent to do that at this particular point. And as I was there this past weekend in Texas and in Arizona this weekend, I believe that it is time to bring the providing states together and say, how can we best do this? Arizona eventually will get tired. Their folks have other ongoing global deployments and other jobs and schools and such that they may need additional assistance. But so far, I believe that the current level of support that we are providing is sustainable for the long term in both Texas and Arizona as National Guard Title 32 support.
Well, and I just want to say how much we appreciate your work in Arizona and welcome that. And if my office can be of any assistance, please don't hesitate to call on me.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to just ask about the F-35s and about the delivery to the National Guard units in Montgomery, Alabama. And just want to ask about, is that still on track for 2023? And also all the MILCON needs included that as well.
Yes, sir. It is still on track. Congratulations to Alabama. I'm sure they're very pleased with the acceptance of the F-35s there. And to my knowledge, they should all be on track to accept those in about the 2023 timeframe. I know of no issues with respect to MILCON, environmental issues that would inhibit that.
What about what's being done to ensure that the environmental impact study is completed in a timely fashion?
You know what I'd like to do? I'm not aware of any issues with the environmental impact study, but I will check on that and report back to you as soon as I find out. Okay.
And it is my understanding that the Army originally planned to have have Gray Eagle companies in all the 8 reserve component divisions. But my understanding, no aircraft has been assigned to the Army National Guard. Are there plans to establish a National Guard MQ-1C capability rather?
So, sir, I think that, again, I'd like to get back with you on that particular question. I'm not aware of any issues or the Army considering establishing additional Gray Eagle capacity in the Army National Guard, although we would, if we could recruit to it and have it, we would. Obviously, Alabama's a large National Guard state. You know, I think I'd like to look at that and also get back to you, give you specifics about the Gray Eagle.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, General, for being with us. I had the opportunity to sit down with some of the folks from the Guard in the state of Washington just last week and got an update on the Cyber Mission Assurance Team Pilot Program, which is a mouthful. But one of the things I came away with was the notion that states definitely need reinforcements when it comes to addressing some of these cybersecurity issues. If there's an attack on critical infrastructure, that can very well be a national security issue. If there's attacks on our election security, that's an issue of national security as well. And having that cost and that risk basically be borne by just the states on their own, I think would be very challenging. And I appreciate that the Guard, through this pilot program, seems to be appreciating that reality. I was hoping you could just give a little bit of, tell us a little bit about the program, if you have any insights into its progress, what we've learned from it so far.
So yes, sir, thanks for the question. I think, you know, the cyber domain is, we're under attack every single day. And what we've come to realize is many of our federal installations are relying heavily on non-federal utilities and power plants and other things on the grid that enable it to continue to do its work. So the cyber mission assurance teams are designed to help make sure that you know, the critical infrastructure that's really not related to the installation could be made to be mission assurance, so such that the mission of the federal installations could still be used. We picked 3 states for the initial test. And these states, Washington State being one, Ohio being one, Hawaii being the third. It's early in the program. The program's designed to, it was designed to be about a 2-year test, so it won't end until 2020. About the springtime of 2020, we'll be able to assess what kind of impact they're able to have. But in the pilot program, we allowed each state to kind of come in with their own concept of operations on how they best would do this. We didn't want to define for them how it is. They'll use commercial off-the-shelf software to maintain and check utilities and secure other critical infrastructure that could impact the operations of the installations. And then we'll make an assessment. Is this something that we should invest in more broadly across the nation? So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that particularly a state like Washington that is on the high-end side of cyber capability with lots and lots of civilian expertise that can help us identify these risks. I'm hopeful that these will be seen as value added.
Is your gut right now, and I know that Mr. Ryan touched on this issue too, is the gut right now to, it sounds like at least extend it an additional year, the pilot, and then potentially to stand up a program in this regard, or?
Well, it'll go right now. The test goes until 2020. And so, you know, we haven't had to come to a decision yet where we would extend it by any means, but we'll see what it says, and we'll show to this committee and to others, here's what these teams were able to do, here's what they were able to find. We'll see if there's value in that, and if there is value, they're relatively small teams, about 10 people, and only 3 of them, people on that team, are full-time. So it's not a big footprint in terms of manpower, but you know, we'll see what they provide, and then we'll make a recommendation as to whether or not this is something that we want to go nationwide.
I was really compelled by it for what it's worth. I mean, these were men and women who, you know, spend their day at Microsoft and Amazon and cool tech companies, and then take that knowledge with them to try to protect our national security from within the cyber domain in particular. So,
yes, sir.
Found it very compelling. I want to respect the time, so I'm happy to yield back.
Mr. Aguilar, you have been a very active member this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General. If I could fill in a little bit, I'm not from the distinguished state of Washington, but if I could piggyback on my colleague's question, how long does it take to stand up, you know, personnel in the cyber domain? Would be my first question. And do your units receive sufficient training for military cyber schools? And to what extent do we use civilian organizations to help provide that training?
So the, you know, our cyber capacity and the units inside the National Guard are reaching some level now, after 6 years of really building them hard, of some level of maturity. So we have 11 cyber protection teams in the Army Guard. We have 12 cyber protection teams in the Air Guard. We have additional cyber units that do cyber intelligence and those kinds of things that are growing, and now they are maturing. This emergence of this cyber mission assurance team, as we were just discussing, is a new part of it. But, you know, it takes a while, and it's quite technical, and to be a cyber warrior, there's a rigorous joint school process that you have to go through. It's still a challenge for us to find school seats and to get the right people that can go and do those kinds of things, and that's why we tend to want to stay in big states with big cyber industry presence. We have experts that are good at this and can get through the school systems and the training slots to do it. You know, I think that as far as using civilian training activities, I'm not aware of any case where we're doing that, or we're going to military schools and trying to find cases where we can give people with civilian acquired skill sets credit for having been trained in cyber techniques before, but they still have a pretty rigorous joint training process that they have to go through, which is in the military.
Should we use more incentives to get the right folks in these hard-to-fill positions?
Well, I think in any of these skill sets, cyber being one, space will soon be another, that have a high dollar draw for these skill sets in the civilian world, we're going to need incentives and bonuses to retain them to do also a military job in the National Guard, which I think we do and will continue to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. General, I'd like to touch upon two areas. The first deals with contamination at various facilities. And if I could just refer to the two chemicals and the problem as PFOs to simplify this conversation, I would appreciate your indulgence. It is my understanding that it is the responsibility of EPA to set a maximum contamination level for these chemicals. Am I correct on that?
Sir, I believe that's correct. It's EPA's responsibility to do that.
I also understand and am disappointed, and this isn't directed at you personally, that the Department of Defense writ large is privately pushing EPA to adopt a weaker standard. And when we're talking about the toxicity of water for lifetime health advisory for human drinking water, I think that is inappropriate, and I think it's wrong. I don't think we should shirk our responsibility, whether it's DOD or any civilian agency, from cleaning up our mess. I also, because we've had this conversation in different permutations over the last couple of years, disappointed by what appears to be a lack of seriousness and speed and deliberateness about the negotiations to determine liability at the sites that are located with civilian airports. I live in Gary, Indiana. I have spent my life and continue trying to clean up Superfund sites, brownfield sites, and everything in between. So I do not diminish the difficulty of this problem, which is why I am emphasizing it. Because it is my understanding, if a standard is ultimately set, to end up at a cleanup. We're talking about preliminary assessment and inspections up to 3 years, then a remedial investigation feasibility study up to 4 years, then a proposed plan for another year, then we need an agreement on record for a decision for a year, then we need design and construction for up to 3 years, and then we can start. And we're talking about human health. So my first concern is the issue of we ought to have appropriate standards, and whether or not DOD is pushing to have a lower standard, so maybe the difficulty and expense is not so great. And as far as negotiations, I also realize, because many of these are shared facilities, and each would be unique as to who shares what portion of the responsibility. And again, I'm not diminishing any of this. But with all of the steps that need to take place, I'm wondering how we're doing. And I'm looking at the budget for the last couple of years, and it is my impression that in fiscal year 18, we had $20.6 million set aside. In fiscal year 19, we had $12.7 million set aside. The request by the administration for 20 is $4.5 million. So my sense is if there's also a fiscal indication as to the importance the administration attaches to it, it is going down to zero. So generally, I'd like to have your impression and what can be done about this. I think it's a very serious problem.
Yes, sir, Chairman. I honestly, I'm not aware of any attempt by the DOD to lower the standards or deal with the EPA to change the numbers. I'm not aware of that. I am very aware of the issue, PFOS, PFOA. I'm very aware that widely it's going to be indicated at some level in many installations across the nation, not just air, but Army National Guard from my perspective. Broadly speaking, clearly we have to do the right thing by the communities we live in. We have to protect the water systems. We have to make sure that we analyze it, we find it, we determine how it got there, the speed in which all of that happens, the assessment to the investigations to ultimate ending with some sort of remediation does take time, and I don't know how to make that happen faster. Other than I can tell you that from my concern in the National Guard, I'm very concerned that the funds required to investigate it, the funds required to remediate it, currently, for the most part, are not available to us like the rest of DOD. We are not able to access the Defense Environmental Restoration account to fix these issues when we do find the problems. So that's my concern is, as you are aware, the Office of General Counsel has opined that the National Guard and state facilities are not authorized to use that account. We have to use training or O&M accounts to investigate these things and to provide any mediation.
If I could
so over
ask,
time, I'd like to consider that we
Would
change
the gentleman yield on this for a second? I used to, back in my prior chairmanship, had EPA under my jurisdiction, and so I'm somewhat familiar with this problem and all the military bases around the country, especially this PFOS issue and the cleanup issue. But it's mostly the EPA's fault because of their slow bureaucracy that they move at. But there's new technologies that can totally clean up these sites, and EPA refuses, and the military establishment they go through these old pump and treat operations, which seems like never ends. This new environmental technologies that they have completely cleans up these sites. That's what the brownfield sites, Superfund sites, and gets them back in the economy. So I hope we can take a look at that, encourage the military, EPA, and others to start looking at these new technologies to actually clean the sites up entirely and get them back into the economy, which will help especially these poor areas.
I'd like to know, General, if I could get back to your comment, for fiscal year 19, there's $12.7 million set aside in that account. So what happens to that $12.7 million if the Guard can't use it? Is anybody using it for anything?
Sir, I would imagine we'd be able to use it, to do the investigations or clean it up. If that money was allocated to us, I think maybe to repay some systems who had already spent dollars to clean up they had found it and needed some remediation, and they were actually able to come back from us and get some money to pay them back. I believe that's what that $12.7 million is supposed to pay for.
Do you know, and I mentioned the steps in the process, and the first one is assessment, whether or not the Guard, and again, I understand the uniqueness of each one of these sites, I agree with Ms. Keller. Have they all been assessed?
They are, not all of them, no. They're in the process of being assessed now.
Could you provide the subcommittee with a list?
Yes, sir.
Please? And as to whether at least the assessments have been completed, if not, what the status of each one of those sites is, I would appreciate that.
Yes, Chairman.
I would ask also, and kind of following up with Mr. Calvert, we don't have jurisdiction over EPA, but obviously it's within the jurisdiction of the full committee. If you could also provide, for the record, the person responsible at the Department of Defense for these negotiations with EPA to have a standard set. so that we could have the responsible person in the same room with the responsible person at EPA and have a reasonable meeting. The second thing is, I'll hold there. The second area I want to cover is your operation and maintenance facilities. For the facility sustainment, restoration, and maintenance account, there's an increase of $219 million. And for the base operation support, an increase of $63 million. Both increases for fiscal year 20. The usual activity would be for the base operations support to be doing the engineering activity and for it to be executed. With the additional monies, do you have the necessary engineering personnel to perform those responsibilities?
Well, sir, yeah, I would say we normally do, but I'm gonna go look, I'll look at this money and see the specific projects that you're talking about and make sure that we have the engineering capacity to look at it, but I would think we do.
Okay. And would it be the anticipation, because of the $219 million increase, that given that engineering and design during fiscal year 20, that there would be time remaining in the fiscal year to obligate those additional funds for the facility sustainment restoration account?
Chairman, I'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay,
I have to provide that for the record.
good. Yield to Mr. Calvert.
Just one comment, Mr. Chairman. As we move forward with this new Space Force that the administration obviously is promoting, I would like to, if we can stay informed about what the Guard is going to be doing as we move forward on this proposal. What role do you think the Guard's going to be involved in? There's a lot of rumors going around about where things are going, how things are being plugged in. This committee needs to be informed of that because there's dollars attached to that. These various commands, you know, this would be a combatant command, how we're going to work this out. So any information that affects that, we would appreciate having. So.
Yes, sir, I'll be happy to pass that to you. I've been an advocate and made the recommendation that should they decide to create a Space Force, that the capabilities that are in the Air National Guard and Army National Guard become part of that Space Force as a Space National Guard. But that's yet to be determined. That's details to be worked out should this Congress decide they want to create a Space Force.
General, I'm over my brain lock now. The second question I had to follow up is for the negotiations on liability at each site.
Say that again, sir?
For the liability at each site?
Yes, sir.
Is there a separate individual doing those negotiations, or is there an office with a director in DOD that is supervising all those negotiations at these sites as to how are we going to apportion responsibility? Because again, I would understand we shouldn't pay for something that's not a federal responsibility. On the other hand, again, I hate to beat my district to death. We take 7 years looking for a shell corporation that went bankrupt and is now offshore to help pay for something. 7 years later, we haven't done a thing. So that negotiations on responsibility are important too. Is there an office at DOD that is supervising all of these, or is this a base-by-base issue?
No, sir, I'm sure there is a process that determines each individual site that as we analyze them at each particular one, there would be a method, and I can't tell you what that office is, to negotiate, investigate, litigate, to determine what the appropriate percentage of liability were to be for the Department of Defense or federal liability and state liability, but I can't tell you exactly who that is.
If you could, for the record, that would be
I will
terrific.
put that also in my report.
Great. We have a second panel, but if there's a quick question from any of the members?
I would just like to add my support to the discussion you were just having that Mr. Calvert jumped into, that I think, you know, Northern Ohio, Southeast Ohio, Southwest Ohio, I mean, the industrial Midwest, we've been dealing with this. You know, you just want to bang your head against the wall because these communities continue to fall further and further behind. So if we can find some kind of leadership within defense, which obviously the history of the military has always been on the cutting edge of solving some really big problems for us. I just want to publicly say I'm all into that.
Yes, sir.
General, thank you very much for your service and your time today.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. Thank you.
We'll have to get Betty and David on there. Really? I would like to welcome Panel 2, the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force Reserves. I would encourage members to continue to participate. I want to welcome Lieutenant General Charles Luckey, Chief of the Army Reserve, Vice Admiral Luke McCullum, Chief of the Navy Reserve, Major General Bradley James, Commander, Marine Corps Reserve, and Lieutenant General Richard Scobie, Chief of the Air Force Reserve. Gentlemen, we are pleased to have you before us today as witnesses. We thank you for your service and your testimony today. Please proceed with your testimony. Your full written testimony will be placed in the record. Given the size of the panel, brevity would be appreciated. Obviously, in your answers, completeness would be appreciated, along with, again, succinctness. I would leave it to you to begin. Thank you very much.
Great to be back here.
Excuse me, I did not recognize Mr. Calvert.
Well, that's, Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I just want to thank the chairman for having this hearing, and from all of you, I'd look forward to your testimony. And with that, without wasting any additional time.
Chairman, again, and ranking member, it's great to be back in front of you this afternoon. On behalf of the 200-some-odd thousand soldiers in America's Army Reserve, their families, and the employers across the nation and across 20 time zones that support this force, I appreciate you, I appreciate your interest, and I appreciate all your support for our soldiers, their families, and the employers that are supporting all of us. In preparing to meet the challenges of new and evolving threats around the world, the Army Reserve continues to train and organize and posture itself to identify early deploying formations, aggregate additional capabilities, and move quickly to accomplish post-mobilization training tasks in order to meet the warfighter's time-sensitive requirements. This construct, Ready Force X, remains, as you know, the way in which we focus energy, optimize our processes, and prioritize our resources to deliver capabilities at the speed of relevance for a major war. Early deploying RFX capabilities need to be able to move quickly, in some cases in days or weeks, in order to support the joint force in any significant conflict or demonstration of national resolve. We do not call this fighting tonight. I do call it fighting fast. Readiness is what we're building. We continue to do it. We have expanded upon the RFX construct, and we're more ready than ever. While we fully acknowledge that our first responsibility is to bring our unique capabilities to the fight as part of the total Army and winning the nation's wars, We also embrace our opportunity and our mandate to respond at no notice to disasters in the homeland, to take care of our fellow citizens at their time of greatest need. Our soldiers and facilities and capabilities postured in thousands of communities across the nation stand ready to deploy in very short notice and pursuant to immediate response authority as needed by our fellow citizens. Our key responsive capabilities include search and rescue units, aviation assets, routine route clearance engineers, medical units, water supply and water purification operations, and we've provided assistance, as you well know, during many major events, including hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, Florence, and a variety of other disasters, to include work we did just last week in Nebraska in response to flooding. For the past 2 years, America's Army Reserve has been on a path to seize digital key terrain. As many of you know well, this journey presses the Army Reserve's Innovation Command, headquartered in Houston, Texas, and now in direct support of Army Futures Command, to assess and develop emerging outposts and technology hubs across the country. The command serves as a link for operational innovation and development of concepts and capabilities to enhance the readiness of future force by capitalizing on extensive civilian acquired or retained skills, knowledge, and experience. We're uniquely positioned as your federal force to provide the Army with an array and staying on pace with rapidly emerging trends and opportunities in the private sector, while also providing a potential pool of on-demand talent for the Army Futures Command. As it pertains to cyberspace operations, we remain steadily on glide path to establishing the 10 cyber protection teams, which I know is of some concern to the committee here this morning, at locations around the country, such as San Antonio, Boston, Pittsburgh, and the Bay Area in California. Army Reserve cyber soldiers bring unique skills and experience to the force from their civilian occupations, drawn from over 40 corporations, financial institutions, and academic centers of excellence. We provide direct support to Army Cyber Command and other governmental agencies. We remain grateful to Congress for passing the FY19 Defense Appropriation Bill and for ensuring consistent and predictable funding, which will build Army Reserve readiness and support into the future. Finally, we've been able to leverage the congressionally provided National Guard and Reserve equipping account in AGRIA to purchase key systems, both from a modernization perspective and from a dual purpose perspective, including the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle in a very small quantity, weapons firing simulators, wet gap crossing equipment, and a wide variety of dual purpose capabilities that can be used either to support the warfighter or our fellow citizens in time of response to a disaster. As I've previously testified, there's an inherent challenge in a part-time force. This team needs to be ready enough to be relevant, but not so ready that our soldiers cannot maintain good, meaningful civilian employment and healthy, sustaining family lives. This nimble and efficient part-time force would not be possible without our civilian employers around the globe and our families. They are essential partners in national security, sharing the best talent of the world with us. And they continue the commitment and sacrifice which allows our soldiers to serve the nation while maintaining rewarding civil employment and sustaining family lives. We have a deep appreciation for employers who share their workplace talent with America's Army Reserve. I appreciate, again, your sustained support. I appreciate your interest in the readiness of the force, and I also appreciate what I know all of you share with me, which is your concern about balancing readiness of our soldiers with their ability to maintain their civilian employment and sustain the support of their employers and also of their families. I appreciate this committee. I appreciate your support. I look forward to your questions.
Well, good morning, Chairman Visclosky and Ranking Member Calvert, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. And it is my distinct honor to report on the status of the America's Navy Reserve, which is a highly skilled and integral part of the Navy's enduring and worldwide fighting force. This morning, we have over 3,045 reserve sailors serving in some of the most austere locations around the globe. Without the unwavering support of employers and loving families in this committee, the reserve sailors would not be the force multipliers that they are today. I believe I speak for all my colleagues sitting here with me today as I offer most sincere thanks for your support. Focused on the objectives of the National Defense Strategy of warfighting readiness, we are building a more lethal Navy Reserve. PB-20 is the mechanism that will allow the Navy Reserve to continue to focus on strategic depth. The Navy Reserve utilizes two key enablers, which we're very thankful for, which is our discretionary RPN and flexible NGRIA. And they fund to generate both capability and interoperability with our force of the active side as well. Your continued support to ensure these accounts remain robust and consistent and predictable is critical to our success. Similar to the active component, The Navy Reserve seeks funding amongst readiness, wholeness, and investment. PB20 is prioritized accordingly. Your support of the C130 avionics upgrade is to extend its service life is very much appreciated. PB20 brings also the Navy's maritime patrol inventory to 117 aircraft, and should additional resources become available, the Navy included P-8s in its unfunded priority list that supports the recapitalization of the reserve force toward the requirement of the warfighting requirement of 138, and also allows the Navy Reserve squadrons in Whidbey Island and Jacksonville to continue to operate beyond 2023. Similar to aviation, recapitalization of the expeditionary forces and within the Navy Reserve is very important. Your support of the 4 40-foot patrol boats in PB20 will accelerate a more lethal Navy Reserve. Additionally, the force is growing its focus in cyber and extended its Joint Reserve Intelligence Commanders to provide more capability as well. In closing, I would just say I could not be prouder of our Navy Reserve Force, and every time I set foot around the globe to visit our sailors who are forward deployed in our reserve centers, in our aviation squadrons, I come away extremely inspired by their dedication and their motivation to apply both their military skills and their civilian skills toward warfighting lethality within the total force. On behalf of the Navy and Navy Reserve, I thank you for your support and the time here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon, Chairman Vislavsky and Ranking Member Calvert and all the distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to testify on behalf of the Commandant of the Marine Corps about your Marine Corps Reserve. I'm honored to be here with my fellow Reserve Component Service Chiefs. Mission of the Marine Corps Reserve is to stand ready to augment, reinforce, and sustain the active component. Along with the active component, we have reserve forces forward deployed supporting combatant command's requirements. Over the past year, more than 2,100 Reserve Marines were mobilized supporting 35 operational requirements in each of the 6 geographic combatant commands. Additionally, 754 Reserve Marines have volunteered as individual augments, which filled 63% of the service's requirements. I'm pleased to inform you that the morale of your Marine Corps Reserve remains high, as evident by the Reserve component end strength maintaining 99% of the total requirement. I'm constantly impressed by the professionalism, the competence, the dedication to duty, and the motivation of our Reserve Marines. Like their active duty sisters and brothers, they serve selflessly to protect our great nation. The way they balance family responsibilities, civilian lives, jobs, schools, careers is nothing short of extraordinary. At any given time, Marine Forces Reserve stands ready to provide a brigade-sized element of Reserve Marines and sailors fully trained for combat operations, while the remainder of our force is poised to augment and reinforce given appropriate amounts of pre-deployment training based upon their wartime mission assignments. I'd like to leave this distinguished body with 2 thoughts on how continued support from Congress can result in a more ready and lethal Marine Reserve force. Number 1, I want to extend my gratitude for your continued support of the National Guard and Reserve Equipment appropriation. I would appreciate a greater spending flexibility within this appropriation in order to procure critical shortfall items and modernize equipment and systems. Number 2, I would like to thank you for this year's appropriations. On average, the Marine Corps Reserves only have 38 training days a year. That places an increased importance on the adequate and timely appropriation. With your continued support, I can ensure the Reserve's predictable and uninterrupted training schedules to maximize personnel, material, and training readiness. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and look forward to your questions.
Chairman Vislavsky, Ranking Member Calvert, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to report on the readiness of America's Air Force Reserve. I am joined today by Chief Master Sergeant Tim White. He's the Command Chief for the Air Force Reserve Command. As a critical component of the total force, the Air Force Reserve provides cost-effective strategic depth, rapid surge capability, and operational support to our joint force. Our 70,000 citizen airmen are both interchangeable and integrated with their active component counterparts. We fly as one, we train as one, and we fight as one. The Air Force Reserve's current objective is to prepare to operate in tomorrow's battle space while providing excellent support to our airmen and their families. To ensure alignment with the National Defense Strategy, we are focused on prioritizing our strategic depth, accelerating our readiness, developing resilient leaders who can generate combat power, and we want to reform our organization to optimize our warfighting capabilities. The on-time allocation of fiscal year 2019 budget greatly bolstered the Air Force Reserve readiness, and we know you're working hard to ensure the timely allocation for fiscal year 2020 budget. We thank you for your continual support and your diligent efforts to ensure we receive the predictable funding we require to defend this great nation. The Air Force Reserve has improved our overall readiness during the past year. We are better prepared at the unit level, and our individual readiness has also increased. Our nuclear deterrence forces are mission ready, and we have expanded our mission capabilities by activating our first cyber wing and our first intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance wing. Additionally, we are aligning our space units to meet the future space mission force requirements of our nation. We have improved our lethality by modernizing our weapons systems with the National Guard Reserve equipment appropriations, and we thank you for these funds, which we have used to also purchase much-needed support equipment. We remain focused on our personnel programs and reaching our end strength. We are targeting full-time manpower shortage with a variety of initiatives, including converting approximately 1,200 full-time authorizations from Air Reserve technicians to Air Guard and Reserve positions. The Air Force Reserve has built our success on the hard work of our airmen. Therefore, it is imperative that we ensure our reserve citizen airmen and their families have the support, resources, and care they need. This committee can help improve the quality of life for our airmen by supporting legislation to authorize our dual-status technicians the ability to receive medical coverage under TRICARE Reserve Select Healthcare Plan. This initiative would improve healthcare access for our Air Reserve technicians and their families. And it would significantly increase the retention of our Air Reserve technician, which is my most challenging status. The Air Force Reserve will continue to increase readiness as we posture our force to meet future operational requirements. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and for your unwavering support as we ensure the Air Force Reserve remains prepared to defend our nation. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hate to ask this question, but we need an answer for the record. If the Congress fails to reach an agreement on the budget, what impact will a second round of sequestration have on your ability to meet your mission requirements? We just get an answer from each one of you.
So, ranking members, you well know it has significant impact, obviously, just to the extent that we have been focusing a lot of our energy over the last several years on the readiness of this force in terms of additional training days for critical training activities. I know you're familiar with the cold steel program that we instituted a couple of years ago. That has been an additive requirement, both from the standpoint of purchasing additional ammunition, but also additional training days to get our soldiers trained and proficient, frankly, in some skills that they hadn't exercised in a long period of time. So that's just one example of where I would see a significant impact to the readiness of this force over time.
Congressman, thank you for that question. A reservist is at their best, as you know, when they're in a good, predictable place with both their family, their employer, and their military obligations. Introducing a lack of predictability causes significant churn in the reserve force. The programs that we focus on for building warfighting readiness are those additional training days. The ability to build strategic depth would be affected as well, so there would be a significant impact should that occur.
Thank you.
Congressman, I'll parrot the same as my two colleagues have said. So it's readiness, it's predictability for us as we continue to train to a larger level command and control. I think we would step back a little and just more of an individual from a perspective of readiness to more of an individual training.
Thank you.
Ranking Member, I would agree with my colleagues, and I'd also say that I can put a fine point on this. A return to sequestration would erase the gains we've made over the last 3 years in the Reserve Command.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Luckey, we spent a little time together yesterday, and you were talking about something I found very interesting along the lines of suicide prevention. And I would love for you to share with the committee what you talked about with regard to being underemployed, unemployed, or underemployed, and the connection that you saw?
So thank you for the question, Congressman. As you know, I'm pretty passionate about this, and we're working pretty hard in the Army Reserve, as I know all of my colleagues are in all of the services across the department. I'll just say we've done a pretty good job of trying to figure out where we can find common threads of concern, so we can, I'll use the term, focus our energies on some of those soldiers who may be more challenged. I look at a couple different factors, but the one that's probably the most pronounced is about 50%, as I think I shared with you, of our soldiers who either effectively commit suicide or attempt it in a very determined fashion. Our analysis tells us either completely unemployed or what I would regard as significantly underemployed. We have targeted our private-public partnership program in the Army Reserve as essentially a tool to help those soldiers who are underemployed, once we've identified them, which frankly is part of the key, helping make sure that we're giving them additional energy, additional attention, additional resources to find good, meaningful jobs. The reason I raised the issue, as you well know, is I remain concerned, as I said in my opening statement, about life balance for our soldiers, and particularly those that are financially stressed, because I see it as an accelerant to other stressors in their lives, which can lead to self-destructive behavior.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I appreciate your focus on it. Thank you. General Scobie, I want to just read, we had some language put in the report last year encouraging the Chief of the Air Force Reserve to review requirements to ensure the specialized units are allocated sufficient training hours to successfully perform both their specialized and tactical missions, and are allocated equipment upgrades necessary to address safety concerns associated with these missions. When deciding which specialized missions to target for equipment upgrades, the committee urges the strong consideration to be given to those missions utilizing the oldest equipment. In Youngstown, at the Air Reserve Station there, we have the aerial spray unit, as you know. Can you talk to us a little bit about the plans to recapitalize the existing C-130Hs as they age and the maintenance costs escalate?
Congressman Ryan, our plan in the Air Force is right now we have in the Air Force Reserve, we have 2 units that have J model C-130s, and the rest of our units are all H model C-130s, as is Youngstown. Our plan right now is to go through the upgrades, both the avionics upgrades, AMP-1 and 2, for our C-130Hs as we improve those. If the Air Force has money and they're going to additionally recap H model C-130s, my plan is the same as my predecessor, and as we are going to go through our basing process to see where those airplanes would go in. But our fundamental basis is going to be that we put those aircraft in our special missions, which include the firefighters and the aerial spray at Youngstown. And then we'll look to the corporate process to determine where those aircraft would best be needed. Aerial spray is one of our most interesting missions because it also has a combat-related mission as well with spray, and I think it's vitally important.
Right. I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome all of you. We're glad to see you here. We'll try to get one question that might fit everybody, but I can't do it, so I'm going to. General Lucky.
Sir.
We talked about this when you visited. We've visited several times, and I enjoy it every time we do. The full-time support for employment, you just briefly mentioned it. Has anybody got any, and I'm sure all of you have an issue with keeping your people employed back home while they're serving their country in the reserve. Are there ideas out there to enhancing the employment opportunities for our reservists and any of the services? That's one question you can all answer. We want everybody to be gainfully employed while they're serving in the reserve. And I know that's a challenge sometimes. We don't want to put any more burden on people's families than we have to. Are there any ideas or programs that people are using to help them become more gainfully employed?
So I touched on it a minute ago, Congressman, briefly, but we do, so internal to the Army Reserve, we do have this private-public partnership, which is essentially a series of relationships, hundreds of them, in fact, with employers across the nation that enable us to sort of leverage that connection, leverage that foot in the door, so to speak, to help our soldiers find meaningful employment. And we have a number of facilitators out there helping our soldiers build resumes and that sort of thing. So there are things we're doing to get after it. But my point earlier to Congressman Ryan's question really is from a concern that I have as a leader of this force, I'm particularly focusing those energies on those soldiers that we've identified as either underemployed or unemployed altogether. The other thing I would say, and I've mentioned this before, I do think there's some goodness in at least thinking about as a matter of sort of national resolve, some way for us to essentially acknowledge what I regard as a strategic partnership as part of the national security fabric of the United States of America between the employers of America and the reserve components, all represented here at this table, where employers across America get a very strong sense of the patriotism they're exhibiting by continuing to share this talent with us. And I would leave that to the senior elected leadership of the United States to sort of sort through what that might look like. I don't have any silver bullet there, Congressman, but I do think that we should be messaging to this force and to the employers that support this force how critical that partnership remains for national security.
Congressman, certainly we feel in the Navy and the Navy Reserve that leveraging industry, public and private partnership is so key to making this successful. When I do engagements around the country to see our sailors, we will parse off engagements with cities and organizations such as Navy League and people that the ESGR recommend that we contact. Executive visits with cities. Recently, I was in St. Louis, in Detroit, and San Antonio, and I engaged with the employers and talked about this very thing. As a matter of fact, when I was in Michigan, the governor's council there said, if you can help articulate the equivalent of the qualifications that the Navy Reserve, your reservists have, we will create a match with what we see in industry in our organization. Again, a pursuit to that join up. Finally, I certainly believe in point engagement. I will host about 100 employers to come out to San Diego in June, and we'll allow them to come and see what their sailors are doing. We'll have them on the ships and the aircraft squadrons and Navy Special Warfare, and I will host a reception just to talk about the importance. Previous times we've done this, they've always come back and said, now we really understand this importance and we'll continue to do more.
It's great, some great ideas.
Congressman, from the Marine Corps, we do a few things. We have a yellow ribbon program that we put on for our inactive reserves and then our units that are reserve units that are deploying pre and then post. And as an opportunity for headhunters or employers to come in. We're tied into those local communities. We also have the Marine for Life program, which is run by the reserves. And those are reservists that are out there that are in those communities. And so they can be found on the website, and they reach out and help with the connections in the private and in the public for employment and also just mentorship. We also have the Former Marines Network. I don't think it's a surprise that we're a very proud service, and we're Marines for life unless you do really something bad, right? So wherever you go in employment, and I've seen that, is that we know who those Marines are, and we take care of each other throughout. And just from the aviation side, we also, we're hiring, we have contract maintenance. About 50% of our Marines are in on a full-time basis. Most of them are down in the barn, as we call it, to turning wrenches. And so when we can hire those contract maintenance support teams, we bring them in, and the win-win for us are the reserves when they come in, and we can put them on full-time and getting their touch time on their platforms. And then if we have to use them, put them in the uniform, they go.
Congressman Carter, no surprise, all of the reserve components we talk on a regular basis, and the same thing in the Air Force Reserve. All three of my colleagues have talked about, with the exception of the Marine Network, we don't have that. But the rest of the things we're all in lockstep on. But what is interesting to me is we travel around to our different communities. It is the strength of the communities that we have our reserve components in that is really where we've been able to find employment for our reservists. And that has been one of the strong things that I've seen. So reservists who are successful in what they do, organizations that understand what the commitment of the reserve component is, we find them very amenable to bringing on an additional reservist. So underemployment is not something traditionally we suffer from, but when we do, we have a good network of our local constituents that really want to help.
You know, these people that employ reservists, it is a certain amount of, I don't know, irritation factor to have these people be deployed. It seems like there ought to be something that could be posted. The Army Reserve, the Marine Corps Reserve, thanks this employer for sharing with our military. Because in Texas we see a lot of people have a sign on their window when you go in, or they advertise in their ads, "We hire veterans." I think that we ought to have some acknowledgement. This employer, recognize the employer hires reservists and cooperates with reservists, because I don't know, it just seems like to me they ought to get some kind of recognition, because deployments are getting pretty regular for everybody. And the employers need to be kind of give them an attaboy every once in a while.
So,
Thank you.
Congressman, I'd just say, so I think the services do that, but I would acknowledge your point. We probably, from a scale perspective, don't do it as aggressively or as often as perhaps we should. So I take that.
Pete, I just want to use an opportunity here to plug a bill for myself. Thank you. To share with the committee, HR 801, Congressman Palazzo and I have the Reserve Component Employer Incentive Compensation and Relief Act, which is a tax credit for employers who hire Guard and Reserve. And General Lucky and I spoke about this yesterday. I think it's one opportunity for us to talk about how we can show some appreciation for these employers who make a lot of sacrifices to their own businesses, as we all know. So I wanted to share that with the committee. And Dutch, I'm sure you want to sign on to that immediately.
Yeah, that sounds good. You got me. Okay. I'm going to yield my time to Congressman Kilmer, but before I do that, I want to acknowledge Congressman Calvert for his question about sequestration. I think sequestration is one of the most destructive laws this Congress has passed. It cuts everything across the board. As we know, budgeting is about priorities. For years, when we pass it, I've asked all the panels about the impact of sequestration and how it makes us weaker. And once our military gets their budget, they can't come back and defend it. We have to. So it's still the law. We have to do whatever we can to make our country stronger, to do away with sequestration. I yield.
Thank you to my colleague, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm supposed to be chairing a meeting downstairs, so I went from owing Dutch a glass of wine to now 2 bottles. But yeah. Vice Admiral McCollum, I wanted to follow up on something you referenced in your opening remarks regarding the P-3C Orion aircraft. I recognize the Naval Reserves operate some aging aircrafts over 35 years old at the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville, and also in Whidbey Island, which is not in my district, but is up north of me. As far as I know, there's no plan to extend the service life of that. In that case, these commissions, as you pointed out, these squadrons would be decommissioned in 2023. The recapitalization of these reserve squadrons is the top priority for the Navy Reserve in your unfunded list for FY 2020. I was hoping you could just take a few minutes to explain how the Navy Reserve complement the Navy active duty maritime patrol and reconnaissance mission. Could you tell us why recapitalization of these squadrons is the top funding priority in your unfunded list for 2020? How is readiness affected if these Navy Reserve squadrons go away in 2023, and why is the P-8A the right choice going forward for recapitalization?
Congressman, thank you for that question. As the Navy Reserve focuses on strategic depth, that's part of the overall equation of the total force of the fighting Navy. The maritime patrol capability of the Navy, in terms of its requirement, warfighting requirement, sits right about 138. And PB-20 brings that total number to 117. The AC and the RC are interoperable. They work together, they train together, and the standards are the same. When we look at a more lethal Navy Reserve and we look at our defense strategy and then the named competitors with China and Russia, we know that this capability is very important to our capability. And as I mentioned, that the Navy has established in its unfunded priorities list as its #1 lethality requirement in the UPL. For this recap. So the 2023 is a line which, just because of the service life of those P3s, that they would sunset. And so the idea is if there are additional resources available, that the recapitalization of these aircraft can begin. A key point about this, above the aircraft itself, and that is leveraging the skill sets of these pilots, who many of them fly in the airline. And their ability, in most of the airframes, they fly in the airline or the same airframe as the P-8. So there's a return on investment capture of the pilots, and then the pilots have a career path, and they have a place to sit and fly, and they have flight hours. So usually, if we can maintain those, they want to stay viable. We need all that capability in the strategic depth capability of the Navy for the overall warfighting lethality focus in GPC.
Super. Thank you. And thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is for any of you. While the main roles of the Reserve and Guard components falls under the Defense Department, you are all frequently called upon to help out during natural disasters, especially my home state of Florida, not infrequently. How do your exercises, trainings, and leadership structure translate to disaster response?
So let me take that first, if I may, Congressman. So thank you for the question. So from a training perspective, as you well know, inside the larger national response framework, the reserve components of the military do in fact train to support, and the Army side, Army North, which falls under NORTHCOM for the purposes of supporting sort of writ large disasters in the homeland, and therefore trains to those standards in a series of different exercises. More discreetly, to your question about sort of what are we doing internal to the Army Reserve and to the other services to sort of prepare ourselves and organize ourselves, I would just tell you, I go back to the comment that I made earlier in my opening statement about the investment strategy that we have, largely leveraging, frankly, the financial support we get from this committee and from the Senate. From an equipping perspective in the Army Reserve, I'll give you just one example. So in between Maria primarily and Irma and Harvey, so 3 storms in fairly close succession. As you know, one passed right over the state of Florida. A lot of our resources were immediately committed in immediate response authority, and then some of them continued on to provide support pursuant to requests from FEMA. We consumed many different things, whether it was filters for our water purification systems or equipment that was consumed in the course of providing relief for our fellow citizens. So part of the investment strategy that we have in the Army Reserve is to essentially recapitalize some of those capabilities so that we are immediately reset for the next season to be able to respond again when the call comes. And as I said, we were recently conducting operations last week in Nebraska. So this is something that's an ongoing challenge for us, and frankly, we're honored to do it.
Congressman, the Navy Reserve focuses their response in its capability when events do happen. We do it via exercises. We have what we call HEREX, Hurricane Exercise Responses, and we measure the Navy Reserve's response to the locations where we would expect through our, we call it the NEPLO program, the Emergency Preparedness Liaison Officers, who then connect with the larger defense support to civil authorities construct. Additionally, there's an authority that we have to mobilize short-term reservists for Homeland Defense scenarios in the 12304 Bravo mechanism, or the 12304 mechanism, which there's several variants. So the ability to have an authority, we exercise it, and then we select a cadre of officers to be able to respond to that.
Congressman Christ, I'd just like to echo what my colleagues have said, the great capability that resides in the reserve components. Specifically in the Air Force Reserve, we have two capabilities that don't exist anywhere else. One is the aerial spray, which we talked about before, which we use for, especially after the hurricanes, mosquito mitigation and things like that. And the other is our firefighters. They exist in the Air National Guard and in the reserve component in the Air Force Reserve. Those are great capabilities that we practice and use on a regular basis in order to help protect our citizens.
And Congressman, from the Marine Corps, nothing too far stretched out from what my other colleagues have said, but as our also dual-headed as Marine Forces North, and we run tabletop exercises, computer-based exercises with the Northern Command. We have those MEPLOs, we call them MEPLOs out there. They're liaisons that are tied in with the interagency. And we also bring, water base with our Navy brethren, and back to, Hurricane Katrina. We have aviation assets for the SAR and the logistics, and we also can provide, this past year down in Florida, a forward arming or refuel capability there when the fuel is suspect. We also just we're out in the community. We're Marine reserves, and so we've been able to utilize our Marines that live in those communities have been impacted, and they've jumped right in to help within that.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. General James, in the fiscal year 18 Appropriation Act, $207 million were included for 2 C-40 aircraft for the Marine Corps Reserve. My first question is, I assume there is still a need for that capability for the Marine Reserve.
Yes, sir, I would agree with that. We need that capability.
And it is my understanding that, if you would, the department is looking at procuring 2 aircraft, potentially of a different make, for less money. Would that still, from your perspective with the Marines, meet your requirement? And if so, is there a concern, or what would be your time frame as to when you absolutely need these aircraft?
Sir, the requirement's still there for the Marine Corps. The Secretary of Navy has asked us to look at more economical alternatives. I'll say the utilitarian nature of the airplane is a concern. We need that, not only besides the passenger side of it.
Okay. General Lucky, in the reserve budget, there's an amount of $29.7 million of savings. I think people assume none of you would ever come in with savings. It is described as savings because of better alignment of resources, business process improvements, divestment, and specific policy reforms. In the budget materials, they talk about business process improvements, better alignment of resources. Could you, in some detail, explain for the subcommittee what those savings are, what some of those programs, if I'm looking at it, what would I see?
So I'm going to go on a limb here and tell you sort of what we've done. And the reason I say I'm on a limb is because I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the reforms and some of the places we've looked at cost-saving measures to become more efficient and more effective. Whether that adds up in the totality to the number you just cited, Chairman, I'm not going to say that it does. I don't know that it does. I will tell you, first of all, we've taken a very hard look from a contracting perspective at everything that we're spending money on in the Army Reserve, in terms of Is this a capability that we still need? Do we need it in the same scale or scope that we needed it 10 years ago? As you well know, some of the things that we were doing 10, 15 years ago inside the reserve components of the military, at least from the Army's perspective, we're at a scale that in some cases is larger than what we're doing today. So we've looked at the efficiency of our contracting processes. I would submit that the RFX design, the RFX construct that I talked about again in my opening statement, I've discussed with this committee before, puts us in a place where we are targeting our resources both from a modernization perspective, from a training perspective, and from a full-time support perspective at those formations and capability sets that would need to deploy quickly on very short notice into harm's way, into combat. That gives us essentially an ability to look at those things that we have to do first and tailor and target our resourcing strategy to those early quick deploying requirements. I would also say we've taken a pretty hard look at where we have failed to, in time, de-obligate commitments and then be able to reallocate those funds to essentially to reinvest in readiness. I'm not going to sit here today, Chairman, and tell you that we're perfect at that, but I can tell you we take a very, very aggressive approach to making sure we put standards and discipline into the Army Reserve so we see where we have opportunities to de-obligate, we de-obligate in a timely fashion, and then we reallocate resources to get after readiness. And we're making significant progress in that regard, sir.
General Scobie, in the fiscal year 19 bill, the Air Force Reserve requested was given $9 million because of problems they're experiencing with medical readiness. How is that going in this fiscal year? Would we see some additional, or do we see some additional request in 20 to solve the problems you're facing?
Chairman Visklosky, I'll tell you, that is one of the things that has been the biggest successes that we've had this year. So that with the money that you've allocated to us in order to get after medical readiness, two things were causing us problems. One was a huge backlog of getting narrative summaries done for our airmen that had some underlying kind of problem, either from an injury or an underlying issue with their health. I'm happy to say that we have cleared that entire backlog out, and so now all of our airmen are getting the care they need immediately, and that was a huge win for us in just 1 year. So what the money went to was we put additional doctors on our rolls in order to be able to write those summaries and get our airmen characterized and the right care capacity that they were going to need. And that's what we used all that readiness money for. So if you look at our readiness from a personnel perspective on the medical side, we've made huge strides this year, and more so than any place else, and that is directly a result of the additional monies that we were given.
Would some of those positions have to be made permanent to make sure you don't slide into a backlog? Again, I mean, that's a very good story.
Mr. Chairman, you are exactly right. That my plan is to continue to do that. So right now, with the money you give me, I've been able to fund that for a 5-year program going forward, and we plan on doing that in perpetuity. But yes, sir.
Okay, good. Mr. Calvert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say I appreciate all of your attendance, and we appreciate you at March Air Reserve Base. I think all of you are represented at that base, and the reserves do a fabulous job, not only for our country, but for the community. Thank you.
And I simply would thank you for your service, too. And your offices have been very good to deal with the committee. And I also do thank you for your time, for your preparation and testimony today. We are adjourned.